Resentment is often a signal that a boundary has gone unspoken. We tell ourselves we're being patient. We're just keeping the peace. We don't want to make a big deal out of something. But underneath that patience, we're keeping score. Eventually, the other person pays a price for crossing a line that they didn't even know existed because you haven't shown them. And that isn't fair to them. And it isn't honest of us. So this episode is about boundaries. But let's define what a boundary is. Well, a boundary is just a line that you are not willing to tolerate it being crossed. You're not going to participate in it, you're not going to tolerate it, and you're not going to accept that boundary, that line being crossed within a relationship. It's not necessarily and automatically, a threat or a punishment or a rejection. And it's important to realize that every relationship that we're in has boundaries. Marriage, your wife or your husband, family, son, mother, father, every friendship you have has boundaries. Work, your coworkers, your leadership, coaching and training. When you're coaching and training someone, there's boundaries there you can't cross. Even the relationship you have with yourself has boundaries. Every relationship has boundaries. And so it's not the case that setting boundaries makes for a bad relationship or that there's an issue with a relationship. It's actually the opposite. Setting boundaries is a very healthy thing. In fact, they're the thing that allow relationships to continue without resentment. And resentment is a very quiet poison. It seeps in slowly and slowly until all of a sudden you become the underground man. So let's set some distinctions here. Let's make sure we're getting the terminology right. A boundary governs what you will do in relationship to the line being crossed. I'm going to explain that more later. But a rule is something different. It attempts to govern another person. When you set rules for people, that is not the same as setting a boundary. Let's look at this example. If you were to say to someone, I need you to stop yelling, now that's a request. That's a request. It says I need, but really it's a request. I need you to stop yelling. If you say, on the other hand, if the yelling continues, I'm going to end this conversation and we can try again later. That's a boundary. So you see the difference there. The difference is there's a consequence attached to it. Here's the boundary, stop yelling. The consequence is I'm going to leave the room if you continue to yell. And then the third piece is we can try again later, which is an invitation to come back. And I'll talk about that more later. You can't control whether someone crosses the line. You can control, however, what you do when they cross it. And Brené Brown has spoken quite a bit on this. And she has this very short quote, which I like, and it really applies to this. She says, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. And now what does that mean? Well, it means that setting boundaries is healthy. It's kind. It's a good thing to tell people that you are in any sort of relationship with what your boundaries are. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go around every time you meet an acquaintance and you have to tell them what your boundaries are. Normally, people assume, based on social situations and just the culture, on what natural boundaries are. And so there is a guideline on what constitutes a boundary in our social environment. And so typically this would apply to more personal relationships. But a relationship is a relationship is a relationship. And so being clear is kind and being unclear is unkind. And so that's very important to realize, is that it's not an unkindness to set a boundary. In fact, it's very much the opposite. The other thing that's really important to know when we're talking about boundaries is that boundaries are going to be crossed. That's right. Boundaries are going to be crossed. And so the goal here is not to build a relationship in which no boundary is ever crossed. That's impossible. You're never going to have a relationship where the boundary is never crossed. Why? Well, people forget. People misunderstand what you mean when you communicate with them. And people have bad days. Sometimes people are just grumpy. Sometimes they act selfishly. Sometimes we act selfishly. Sometimes we act grumpy. So the real test of a relationship isn't that boundaries are never crossed. It's what happens after the boundary is crossed. Can the boundary be named? Can you specifically say what it was that was crossed? Can the person who crossed it actually listen without turning the conversation into a trial, an inquisition? Can there be accountability? Can there be repair? And can you move forward? And this is very fascinating with relationships because people think that the good relationships, the ones that last, friendships or romantic relationships, are the ones where people don't fight. And that's actually not true. The relationships that last are the ones that have proven that you can repair it afterwards and move forward. Because we are very imperfect human beings and we are going to disturb and bother each other all of the damn time. So the real test isn't whether or not you actually upset each other, it's how you deal with that after. All that to say, conflict does not have to create distance. If you handle conflict properly, it can actually teach two people how to remain close without disappearing into one another. Because this is something else, a challenge of relationships, specifically romantic relationships, where you can actually become too close and you disappear into one another, where you have no boundaries. And that can also be not good. You have to retain some form of independence. That's detachment in the Stoic sense. The strongest relationships are not conflict-free. They're simply capable of repair. So what do you do, or how do you react when someone sets a boundary with you? Well, this often hurts. So as much as we can talk about how healthy boundaries are and how they set the tone for a great relationship, it still hurts most of the time to have a boundary set upon you because it feels like you don't love me, you don't like me, you don't trust me, you don't want me around, I'm being rejected. But it's important, as the Stoics remind us, that we have to remember that discomfort is not always rejection. Sometimes someone who sets a boundary does it because they want to preserve the relationship. They're telling you, this is a line that I can't have crossed, and I want you to honor that line so that we can have a good relationship between us. So they're telling you the truth, and I think telling you the truth is actually just one of the best things people can do for you. But it is going to hurt a lot of the time. It is going to feel like an insult, and there might even be a little bit of conflict from that. Those feelings are natural and normal because at the end of the day, we're human beings, we're wired for connection. And when someone tells us, there's just this thing that you've been doing that doesn't really sit right with me and I don't want to cross anymore, yeah, that can initially hurt. But the mature response here is not immediate agreement. You don't just simply say, yep, okay, we're good to go. You may actually disagree with the boundary. And that's important to know that, yes, you can actually disagree with a boundary someone sets. You may decide that you cannot live within it, and in which case you might actually go separate ways. The mature response, however, is to hear it clearly, to resist the urge to retaliate, because that always exists, and decide honestly whether or not you can respect it. Now, what if you're the one who has to set a boundary? How do you do that? Well, there's 4 key pieces to setting a boundary. 1, you name it very clearly. Don't make the other person solve a riddle. Tell them exactly what the boundary is, and if you can't describe it yourself, then that's something you have to work on. Name the boundary clearly, very clearly. Number 2, explain what you will do if it continues. And again, this is up to you. This is something that if it's something in an argument, whenever we argue, I don't like it when you say XYZ, you can say, I'm going to end the conversation there and we'll talk about it later. Or you can say, some boundaries are so severe that it might actually end the relationship. Imagine a romantic relationship where you've decided that you're not going to be with other people romantically, and then someone does that. Well, that might actually constitute a boundary that's so severely broken that the response is, I am going to leave you. And we all know that within relationships that there are boundaries that we can't cross that would constitute someone leaving. The third part is really important, which is to follow through. If you set a boundary and repeatedly abandon it, then it's just a suggestion. People aren't going to take it seriously. So you have to follow through. That's why when you set a boundary, you have to be sure that you're actually willing to follow through with it. Because if you don't, it's no longer a boundary. It's simply a suggestion. And number 4 is really important. And it's not always mandatory, but you have to give the person a path back to you. So if someone crosses a boundary, it's not that necessarily all the time. It certainly shouldn't be that you're going to end the relationship and we're just going to go separate ways and that's it. Again, some boundaries are so severe that that is a consequence. However, most of the time, you have to give the person a path back. If you are looking at having a healthy relationship, you have to explain how that repair can happen. What does that look like? So let's say the boundary is when we have disagreements and they become personal, I'm going to step away from the conversation. I'm willing to return, and then we can discuss the issue without attacking each other. That's one that can happen in the workplace. You can be disagreeing with someone at work and it becomes personal, and then you say, you know what, I'm going to step away right now. Let's reconvene tomorrow and not attack each other. And so what you're doing there is you're saying, here's my boundary. Don't attack me personally when we're having an argument or a disagreement. The consequence is I am stepping away. The follow through is that you actually step away. And the path back is, let's talk tomorrow. Perfect. The consequence should protect the line and not satisfy your anger. So make sure you're doing these things with the right intentions behind it. That's very, very important. Epictetus says in Enchiridion 2, use only the appropriate actions of pursuit and avoidance, and even these lightly and with gentleness and reservation. Just an incredible quote from Epictetus, because really what he's talking about here is firmness without tyranny. A boundary can be held without anger or performance, and that's great. Now let's distinguish between boundary and preference. Not everything that irritates you has to become a boundary. It doesn't have to be a wall that goes up every time you're irritated by something. Dishes left behind, yeah, they might bother you, but that might make it a preference. Whether it becomes a boundary depends on how important that really is to you. And what does that represent? And what are you honestly prepared to do about it? Ask yourself when distinguishing between a simple preference or a boundary, is this violating a core value or is this merely just annoying me? Right? So if someone cheats on you, that's a lot different than someone leaving a dirty glass out. Yeah, the dirty glass is annoying, but does it really challenge your core value? Is one of your core values in life to have a perfectly clean house? Hey, for some people it might be. I don't think that's a great value to hold so strictly. Sure, it's nice to have a clean house, but do you really want to lose relationships over it? I don't know. That's up to you. If it's violating a core value, that's what constitutes the need for a boundary. Is there actual harm here? Is there harm here? If someone personally attacks you, there is harm. If someone leaves the door wide open because they're being a little stupid, there's no real harm there. Maybe your heating bill will go up a little bit, but for the most part, there's no harm there. Maybe a little bit of harm to your bank account. Have I clearly communicated what matters? Have I done my due diligence here? Have I been honest? Am I willing to follow through? If this boundary is crossed, am I willing to follow through? So if you tell a friend of yours, hey, whenever you come over, I'd prefer if you took your beer glass and put it in the sink or whatever it is. Before you leave, take your beer glass, put it in the sink. And by the way, if you don't do that, we're done. I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. Are you really willing to follow through with that? I mean, it's just such a ridiculous, crazy, stupid thing to do. But that might be something that annoys you. Is it something that you want to set a boundary on? I don't know. That's up to you. These are questions you have to ask yourself. Am I asking for respect or am I demanding control? Ooh, now this is a tricky one, right? Is this something that I want respect for, or am I just power hungry? And the last question here you can ask yourself on this is, would I accept a comparable boundary from the other person? This mirrors the concern, right? This is, if I set this boundary and the other person set the same boundary, would I be okay with it? So to go back to that glass example, if I tell my partner, if you leave this glass out, we're done. If they were to tell me, hey, if you leave this glass out, by the way, we're done. So we all better make sure that we're really good at cleaning up our glasses. So you need enough self-knowledge to distinguish between something that's non-negotiable and something that's simply just a preference. If everything is a boundary, nothing is a boundary. And now we get to the extreme end of things, because boundaries can go too far. That's right, boundaries can go too far, and they go too far when they become walls. You can become so committed to protecting your peace that nobody is allowed close enough to disturb it. People put up walls and nobody can get in, and that's not good either. You can label every disagreement disrespect. You can name every inconvenience as harm. You can name every compromise as self-betrayal. But at that point, the boundary is no longer protecting a relationship. It's protecting you from having one. Healthy boundaries have strength, but they also have judgment. Boundaries and judgment go together. So there needs to be room for mistakes. There needs to be room for negotiation, for forgiveness, and the ordinary friction of simply being close to an imperfect person. Because let me tell you, if you're going to have friends and have a partner and have a mother and a father and children, you're going to be surrounded by imperfect people, and you better be willing to deal with that to some degree. You better have a little bit of gray. Otherwise, you're not maintaining standards. You're simply ruling a small, very lonely kingdom. Now, that does not mean that you abandon what matters. It doesn't mean you abandon your core values. It means you really have to ask yourself what lines you're willing to hold. Just understand that there's a trade-off. Another person may decide that they cannot or will not remain inside that relationship. So you have power to set whatever boundary you want, but you also have to be willing to accept that a lot of people may or may not accept those boundaries. And so you have to ask yourself, would you rather end up with nobody and have a million boundaries, or would you rather have 10 solid boundaries and have lots of friends? That's up to you. You have the right to set the boundary, and they have the right to make their choice. Let's connect this with Stoicism. The Stoic distinction is simple. Your boundary is your choice, not another person's obedience. So you can decide to set the boundary. You cannot decide to make someone become obedient to it. You control whether you speak clearly, whether you're honest, whether you follow through, and whether you act with fairness. But you cannot control whether the other person understands, whether they agree, whether they change themselves, whether they stay, or whether they decide to leave. A boundary is not a tool for controlling the outcome. It's simply a commitment to upholding your own values. In closing, boundaries are healthy. Period. They don't guarantee comfortable relationships, and they certainly don't guarantee conflict-free ones. They give conflict a structure. They replace guessing with clarity and quiet resentment with honest conversation, and that is the foundation of any good relationship. A healthy relationship needs enough strength to say, this matters to me. It also needs enough humanity to say, you crossed the line, but there's a path back, and here it is. Say what the line is, say what you will do if the line is crossed, follow through without cruelty, without meanness, and leave room for repair, because that's not rejection. That is simply how functional relationships survive harsh truths.